I'm here with Adam Delva, founder and community executive director at DTR, and Jeffrey Turner, professor at Chapman University. And they're here to talk about funding models for open source projects. Hello, hello. So if you want to tell me a little bit about the project to start, that would be great.
Awesome. I guess I'll quickly go first and then I'll pass it to Jeff. So, hi everyone. Adam, I used to work at Microsoft as an Azure specialist and I left to found DTR. We conduct research around blockchain technology, around open source software, generally just how to build software somewhere, right, wherever it ends up. And so I work very closely with Jeff Turner as one of our strategic advisors, and I work with him on a project called Abravera, and I'll let him introduce himself and explain a little bit more about what we're doing with Abravera. So, Jeff?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a adjunct professor over at Chapman University in the computer science department, and I've been working on open source for several years, along with a set of blockchain and crypto projects. And basically, what's come up over the last few years is it's become quite obvious that much of the future of open source is in these new funding models around initial coin offerings and community funding mechanisms, particularly related to tokens and blockchain and even Bitcoin. So we formed a group. It's now simply just an LLC. It's not yet set up as a DAO, but we're forming a group that creates a new funding model using something called smart wallets and smart contracts to fund open source initiatives. And at a high level, that's what Abravera is about. Zoe, if you want, I can share my screen and dig into a little more detail around this if you'd like.
Sure, that would be great.
Okay, I need
Nothing
permissions.
better than a demo.
Yeah, I need permissions to do so. Oh, there we go. All righty. 1 second here. But yeah, the way I see it is that we've gone through basically what happens every time that humanity needs to rescue itself and reinvent itself. We get a new type of capital formation. And we're now in a new phase of capital formation. I don't know if you guys can see my screen.
Not yet.
All right, it's not showing the right. It's not showing the right picture. 1 second. There we go. All right. Hopefully that. So as we've evolved as humanity, or specifically and especially Western society, we've had a series of different types of capital that have been created to fund different ventures. We had a colonial and a post-colonial period with the advent of joint stock corporations and things like the East and West India companies, or even the Mayflower, or many of the colonialization efforts that were originally funded by the crown or monarchies. And we've transitioned now into a post-colonial period where we have public corporations and free banking and such. And the big thing that happened around this time, especially with the Revolutionary Wars and such around the world, was things like the Buttonwood Tree Agreement or free banking and bourses, whereby the stocks, the equities in those joint stock corporations could be sold on exchanges. And then after World War I and World War II, we moved into what I call a free enterprise period. And the big transition here was prior to the World Wars, we had private capital, and then we moved into a new form of capital, which was debt-based public capital, which is pretty much what most of us think of today, if you're in the crypto space, as TradFi. And there was a huge rise in these ventures with with debt-based money and public-private partnerships and such. And then there was a huge revolution that, if you will, that came to the fore with crowdfunding. We had this with Indiegogo or Kickstarter, but really with Bitcoin and even things like Ethereum. And what that in turn did is created a new mechanism for us to fund projects, particularly open source, through tokenization and smart contracts. And now we're in a pretty exciting period because we've gone from private capital to debt-based public capital, now to community capital. And I think this is just the natural evolution of things. To put this into perspective, You know, open source has probably gotten a few $100 billion of funding under the old model here in the green. And as we've moved into this new orange space, if you will, and especially as that relates to Bitcoin, if you're into the orange pill movement around Bitcoin, we've got a new set of capabilities where literally, probably over $1 trillion has now been put toward open source projects. And that's just in the last dozen years or so. Any thoughts or questions?
No, this says a lot. I mean, I've definitely seen.
Pretty deep and dense, so I'm happy to answer anything more specifically about this, but I think that this represents really where we are at and where we're going.
Yeah, and maybe I can bring this over to a tactical use case, right? So one of the things we saw at Microsoft is, open source is important. And so back in the day, Microsoft was looked at as like the closed source, let's, commercialize products and it's our version and we're going to crush competition. And they realized actually we need to invest in this open source movement. And they did that by investing in GitHub, right? So GitHub fits into that green pillar of where we were and where we are. Currently, we're transitioning into this new phase of community capital. But even then, when you think about what's happening with open source, and there's these incredible developers that exist in the world that are contributing to code that becomes mission critical to infrastructure, to software packages, to hardware, right? And it's like, how do we keep the contributors to open source and these critical projects compensated, right? How do they get recognition? How do they get acknowledgement for their contributions to society? Not just from a pat on the back perspective, which they've already gotten. How do they get compensated from a monetary perspective? And that's what the Abravera framework is really looking to address. There's a massive gap between value created and monetization. So we're looking to equalize that quite a bit. And another tactical use case. So we're helping change and reshape the open source crowdsourced funding model. That's step one. Step two, well, now that we have a new crowdsourced funding model, how do we commercialize products so that when a organization that's a Fortune 10, Fortune 50, Fortune 5,000 organization, how do we provide those solutions and tools and also get people compensated in that framework? So effectively consolidating the open source fog, so to speak, and then bringing out outcomes as a function. So if a customer, a large organization that typically spends, for example, $50 million a year on a public cloud provider, what if they reallocated some of that budget, those dollars and cents, to an open source funding model? And then from there, we create products that are philosophically aligned to not only that customer, but potentially the world, right? And that's where we can now distribute not only wealth, but innovation. And so my job at Microsoft as an innovation specialist was to actually do some of that, but under the Microsoft umbrella. And it kind of felt a little bit weird because I had this bigger philosophy, and the Abravera framework actually allows for that philosophy to come to fruition with DTR. By the way, DTR, we have the original author of Docker on our team, which is fun to say, as well as the founder of the IBM Meta Open Source AI Alliance. So we have a very core philosophy around open source contributions. I used to work at Sonatype, which is focused on open source security, right? So like the concepts around open source are very true to me personally, and Abravera enables a new generation of security and just thinking through how to make money in the process of contributing to open source, which is quite radical. So we're very excited to contribute to that.
That is really amazing. It's very upsetting to see hardcore open source contributors out of work. It's absolutely ridiculous. So this is a problem that you're addressing from the human capital perspective as well as innovation perspective, which are obviously aligned. Did you want to speak a little bit more about the, contribution and talent management aspect?
Undeniably. So I'll give you a very tactical example. There's an incredible open source contributor to an open hardware initiative that potentially may allow for vertically integrated stacks in open hardware chip design, right? What does that mean? What does that translate to? What if we had an open source NVIDIA chip? ... That's disruptive, right? So in theory, right, if you have the right architects, the right engineers, the right open source project, you can crowdsource something like that. And we may or may not be involved in that specific initiative. And where do we find them? from the community. So this is just an example of why I'm not chief executive officer, I'm community executive officer, but these are the projects that we can sponsor, fund, crowdsource, and then bring to market by working with the incumbents like Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, insert potential partner for this design process. We can work with them to bring better, more cost-effective chips back to the market, especially which can impact the emerging markets as well, because they may not have $30,000 for an H100 laying around, right? They really do need to reduce cost of overall just general infrastructure and software. This is how to do it.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Wow.
Organic.
Yeah, maybe to take this back a little tangibly in this orange period here, if you will, you know, Bitcoin came along in 2008, 2009, didn't necessarily have an open source model or a foundation or any formal techniques set up to fund the ongoing development. And some would argue that it's kind of atrophied or become ossified as a result. Then Ethereum comes along, let's see, 7 years ago, I think it's been. And it has a complete model built into the system itself to provide continuous funding and make sure that those open source developers get paid for the project. Now, there's arguments against that through this thing called initial coin offerings. And in fact, we're seeing a divergence in the markets if you follow the crypto markets, whereby Bitcoin's price continues to rise and a lot of the what's called ICOs are paling in comparison and with the valuations that they're set versus Bitcoin. And much of that is due to something called a fair launch. Bitcoin underwent a fair launch, whereas Ethereum had pre-allocated tokens, and it was previously set up so that there were a bunch of people that were rewarded just for simply initiating the project. We're now entering into a phase with, particularly with things like smart wallets such as on Ethereum, and that will soon be coming to Bitcoin, where we can create loan and dividend contracts for projects. So this should provide sustainable funding models for open source simply by embedding a smart contract and a wallet into your project. And that's what Abravera is ultimately about.
That's amazing.
So, I mean, I think the big elephant in the room, there's a lot of complaints out there about the lack of funding for open source, but the fact is we probably have north of $1 trillion that's been applied to open source projects through these ICO and tokenization approaches with the smart contracts. So it's pretty obvious to me that that's where the transition is going to happen. And the enterprise FOSS models are just not receiving the same level of funding that you see in the crypto space.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. So did you want to speak a little bit about how AI might come into play as far as evaluating the projects, the quality of projects and the quality of contributions, and how that might fit into the funding model?
You bet. So in fact, my LinkedIn profile is LinkedIn/in/decentralize AI. And you can find this diagram up there if you want to download it. And essentially, I think where we need to move toward is something called verifiable inference, so that you can distribute the AI workloads, at least on the inference side. I'm not sure with regard to something like NVIDIA, whether the AI is split into two pieces. There's the training side, and then there's the inference side. And I think we're going to see a high degree of decentralization and distribution on the inference side. On the other aspect that I should mention here is that a lot of the existing cloud environments are built on what's called a crash fault tolerant model, which has some not quite as good as security properties as you might see otherwise. And you can use something called Byzantine fault tolerance, which is what all the blockchain-based systems are based on, which has much better security and is much more highly decentralized. Up until, I think, fairly recently, though, the problem with Byzantine fault tolerance, or it's known as BFT, it just couldn't perform as well as crash fault tolerance could. But we're rapidly seeing innovation in the space that's making it more performant and lower energy consumption, so it can start competing with the existing cloud models using crash fault tolerance. So I think that's ultimately where AI goes, because we'll have better security, almost nearly the same performance as you get in the cloud, but we'll probably still be training our AIs using these highly centralized things like the Blackwell chips from NVIDIA and such, at least for the near future.
And as we think about, as you can tell, right, there's a capital formation epoch transition, and we've always been talking about for the last 8 to 10 years or so, cloud transformation. We may end up transitioning from cloud transformation to mist transformation, mist computing. And I think it just rolls off the tongue. I think it's and so this is a big part of what we're seeing is, you know, there if you can get the same economic impact or efficiencies or better than a public cloud provider, why not, right? Again, if it's more secure, it has the potential to be closer to your end user, given the regional concerns of the data centers. Why not?
Yep. So we go from cloud crash fault tolerance to mist Byzantine fault tolerance with AI. And this something, no, I mentioned it, I guess I forgot to follow up. There's something called verifiable inference that's emerging as well, which means that you know that the AI is giving you valid information and that it was executed properly inside that mist, so that you can be assured that the question you asked or how you're interacting with it is the actual system, and the prompts that you've given it are actually performing against that system that you're expecting. So I think that's going to become another big opportunity when it comes to AI and decentralizing it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So seemingly you think that from a security perspective, open source projects definitely see a lot of opportunity for security. But are there any downsides that you want to highlight as well?
Yeah, there's, you know, this is the standard argument that's been going on now for, I think, 20 years, that proprietary source is perhaps more secure because you have the obfuscation and secrecy related to how the code is written, versus open source is not as secure because you don't have that. And then the open source crowd will argue that there's much greater transparency and you have many more eyes on the code because it is open source, and therefore it's going to have a better security model. But one of the things that's really, I think, coming to the forefront now is, because you have these highly centralized systems, especially with the proprietary clouds, what we're not seeing is really good security models around that, because they're basically highly centralized. If you can go up to the top of the pyramid inside the cloud and get access to the keys, you get to unlock the entire pyramid. And open source systems are more like a canal system, whereby you have a bunch of individual cellular cells, if you will, throughout the fabric, and it's much more difficult to get access to the entire system just because it's not sitting underneath that pyramid.
Well, I also think about it, you know, very structurally. I've never heard it quite phrased that way, so I'm going to borrow that, because that just that's a really good way of explaining it, because a lot of people want, like, you know, one clear answer, and not viewing it as a multifaceted.
Yeah, and yeah, and the way I kind of think of it is that open source is organic and more like a biological system, versus being like a synthetic, top-down, coercive system, or perhaps highly centralized power structure. So it's, to me, it's going to naturally evolve to a better state of things.
Oh yeah.
And
Oh yeah.
And I apologize, I have to jump on to another meeting, but if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or reach out to me via email there.
Sounds great.
And
Wonderful
Adam, you have access to this, so feel free to leverage it and use the slide.
Awesome, we'll do.
Okay, bye guys.
Thanks, Jeff.
So yeah, I mean that's great. You know, it's a great way to describe the security problems, because yeah, I've never heard it quite phrased that way. We actually had a Web3 bug bounty entrepreneur on, explaining the value of that, which was great, especially since a lot of the viewers weren't necessarily familiar with how bug bounty worked. But then
Yeah.
you also read about hacks based on bad actors knowing how to work the code, blockchain and otherwise, and exploiting it. So you see that, the concept of security through obscurity definitely applies in terms of the proprietary case. But then, I mean, in various aspects, there's also security through clarity is also an approach and a benefit, particularly when it comes to architecture and language design. So our chief scientist actually is a language design expert. So he was presenting on that. Was our Moon's language glow for writing dApps versus Solidity, for example. Fewer lines of code in general, simpler. He can obviously explain the complexities a lot better. But I really like what you said about the community is where it's at, and the community is it's a very technical concept when it comes to blockchain. It's not just human. So
Right.
it really is. Yeah, I mean, it really is one and the same, and it really is interesting, kind of the way of the future.
1,000,000,000%. And so there's a lot of these, I hate using this term, but AI thought leaders. And, there's people that have this concern, existential threat around what do we do when, we have the centralization of power, centralization of intelligence in a few companies. Does that help the people in Ethiopia? Does that help the people in Zimbabwe? Does that help the people in Ghana, in Malaysia, Singapore, all over the world where they don't have as many resources from a financial perspective, but they have the same potential human capacity, right? So those are the types of problems that we were looking to truly solve for on the Abravera and DTR side. I've hosted conferences in Ghana while at Microsoft, and what I realized is there's just these incredibly talented resources and people, humans that are there, and there's just no visibility. They don't know that they exist. And so dApps, decentralized applications, along with what we're going to probably end up coining and pushing is miscomputing. This puts everyone on an equal playing field for the first time, where you now have access to open hardware, open software. DTR is going to be pushing a lot of these open source capabilities to the market. It's been what I've been doing for the last 8 years, which is why Microsoft hired me. But when people put me in a box, I don't do too well. So I had to leave the box. And even if the cloud is still a box. It's funny how that works. So this is, I think, a way to give back to humanity in a parabolic way. So thinking about things as a Kubernetes cluster, you have your worker nodes, you have your, call it, master node. But in this architecture, everyone ends up being a worker node, and everyone can contribute to the work of humanity and get compensated in an aligned model that equals the amount of impact. So a great example of this, again, is like crowdsourcing big projects, the types of projects that you can only imagine. And then, yes, you can imagine it, but then what happens when you have 2.9 million engineers behind it, pushing it to the market, bringing it to humanity? Those are the types of alignment problems that DTR can actually solve for in partnership with the Abraveras of the world. And not many people are talking like this, right? So it's that's why I threw away the chief executive title away. It's like, I'd rather impact the community. And yeah, my share price for my private publicly traded stock will go up, but I know for a fact that the community has been impacted more than I've been able to realize. Which we're not sure if that's the case for some of these corporations. Are they just siphoning energy from humans, or are they giving back and providing resources to the humans that help them get there? Question mark.
Great question. It's a really great question. Really amazing points. Definitely the future of leadership in terms of that thought process. And yeah, well said about that term, thought leadership. But seriously, like at the end of the day, people need the right leadership. People need to be pointed in the right direction, especially as there's so much confusion, potentially misinformation, disinformation online. People need the right leadership, the right ways to follow, and the right ways to follow from wherever they are in the world, whatever their diverse perspective is, eliminate those barriers to access, because we have these tools. We just need to share it in the right
Yeah.
ways.
And ultimately, we're all just get tired of getting laid off by these corporations when they feel like increasing their market value. Like I'm just tired of it. I got, I was impacted by layoffs before. And then when, Microsoft laid off 10,000 employees, I made a statement. I said, all right, well, 10,000 employees, let's address the elephant in the room. Why is this corporation with hundreds of billions of dollars or $80 billion in the bank account laying off these people, right? These people have contributed to the share price to get us here. And, when I realized like we weren't safe, I made a double down to start my business, to start as a founder and make sure that whatever happens after this, I know that I've done my part and my best to ensure that the community is positively impacted as much as I can. My target personally is 100 million in the next 5 years. And so as I wear this t-shirt that says get the millions, it's not necessarily money. It's actually to help positively impact 100 million humans as I go forward with my little startup, my software company that builds enterprise software for the banks of the world and the organizations that use open source. But that's long-term stuff.
So inspiring. I really love it. Oh,
Thank you.
wonderful. Really wonderful. So if there's one piece of advice to kind of the commoner that you can give in navigating all of this, what would it be?
A founder?
Oh, yeah, probably a new founder.
Uh,
Or
oh.
not, or I guess just a developer.
Developer.
Why not?
Yeah, developer. No, I thought you said founder. Okay, so yeah, developers are like if Microsoft has a meme with what's his name, the old CEO, Steve Ballmer. Developers, 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 developers. Yes, awesome, great. But what happens when they're an open source developer and they don't work for a corporation? So getting involved in the Abravera framework early is great. That's more details to be announced there. The idea is you can contribute to code and make money, right? And get compensated for your contributions to society. That's part one. Part two is, engage with your community, right? Like that's my response to almost every problem is like, what community do you exist in? I engage with them and see how you can help them and ask how you can help them before you ask for how they can help you. And then you'd be surprised what happens as a flywheel. Otherwise, if you're just in a silo, you're working by yourself on a problem that nobody else sees, it's not very helpful. So use GitHub, leverage the current incumbent tools, but be sure that there are going to be alternatives to the open source Forge. So that's our mission. It's to build the Forge of open innovation. And I think this is a model of how we do that with decentralized applications, blockchain, and overall just open source contributions.
Love it. Love it. Stay inspiring, everyone, and follow Adam. And it's a wrap.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you virtually.